All right, good evening. Buenas noches. Guten Abend. Gracias a todos y todas. Thank you for all who have decided to join in and those who are going to gradually join in into this conversation. This is truly a conversation space. The that's what tertuliando means. Tertuliando basically, we do have the word conversation in Spanish, and it's basically conversación. But the word tertuliando, it carries out a deeper meaning. It carries out like a gathering. It carries out this sense of intentionality and also this sense of accidentality, because I think accidentality is also a part of life that sometimes we can run away from it. So in this space, I try with each and every one of my guests to convey a safe space of honest conversations, and it seems like a very easy thing to speak, like those words, honest conversation, but to make it happen, to allow ourselves to be as vulnerable as we can, to allow ourselves to be as human. That's what humanity is. So this is what this space is: gathering in quarantine, Tertuliando en Cuarentena, which is in español, because I am from Puerto Rico, as you might see there in the background. So tonight, or today in the afternoon, greetings to all my fellow New Zealanders or Australians or anyone who is watching from the other part of this beautiful planet. Welcome. And you're free to comment, ask questions, whatnot. We'll see how we can bring them in. So today, tonight, and this morning, and this afternoon, we have a person that I met a decade and a half ago, back when I was pilgrimaging in Australia as a young lad. But without any further ado, because I don't want to stretch out this intro, it's just too much. So, any further ado, let me bring Andre Afamasaga. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, but he'll come about and he'll correct me. Did I do a good job with your name, or did I totally butcher it?
You didn't totally butcher it. It's Andre Afamasaga. So
Andre
just the
Afamasaga.
G, Asanga.
Asanga.
Sanger?
Ah.
Yeah, sure.
That's
So
super interesting, because there's that N pronunciation, but
that's correct.
it's not there. Fascinating.
That's right. Yes.
Welcome, Andre.
Well,
Gracias for being here.
yes. Well, talofa lava, tēnā koe, and greetings. Good afternoon from where I am in New Zealand at the moment. Awesome to be here. Thank you.
And I love how this medium can, I mean, to think of it, to think of how spoiled we are that this can happen. This is majestic that we are in completely different time zones, and here we are.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I think the other cool thing is that people get to listen into this conversation. Perhaps people that are either questioning themselves or afraid to sort of even ask those questions. And I'm looking for people that they can relate to. Just this medium is so fantastic for that, isn't it? In terms of sharing our experiences that hopefully other people can benefit from or challenge them accordingly as well.
And it's beautiful, and I recognize it as such. I mean, I've been doing this now for 8 months, and it's been over 100 and some odd number of these.
Wow.
And each and every one of them with people from all sorts of places geographically, and just places in their journey have been. And I tell them, it seems jokingly, but I say very seriously, this has been a therapy for me
Absolutely.
in this time of quarantine.
Absolutely. Sorry, just to riff off that, I remember being involved in some research a little while ago, and we were researching Māori and Pacific people's experiences of gambling in New Zealand. And one of the things that really came through is that as people were participating in the research, so we were able to elicit some really good information for our work, but afterward many people commented mentioning the therapeutic sort of nature of that experience for them, how really good it was to be honest and to have those conversations in a non-judgmental environment. So I think as we share our stories, they are not only helpful for others, but also for ourselves as well. Yeah.
Andre, something that I like to do here is starting off with our present situation, this current time of pandemia, this current time of writing this out now for 4 months, which is, I mean, we are evolving beings. We evolve and we adapt, But nevertheless, these are very interesting times to say the least. And I would like to know, I start off with this sort of like a three layered question. Later on the questions will single out a bit better. I just like to start off like, right off the bat with three questions at once. But, basically to get a feel of what you were doing. What were you doing before this pandemic started? What was your routine professionally, personally? What were you doing at the beginning of 2020? And then pandemia hits. So how did the pandemic affect that which you were doing, and how have you been writing it out? How has that process been? And then the third
Yeah.
part of the question, I can remind you if you forget anyone at the end. And the third part of the question, if you have any observations as far as like any sociological observations that
Mm.
have pandemia has brought to the surface that you think are worthy to talk about. So
Yeah.
what were you doing? Pandemia hits. How has it been? And then kind of like your observations as far as society with this phenomenon of pandemia.
Yeah. So, so obviously life was as normal prior to, COVID. I think so. I'm here in a personal capacity, but in my professional job, I work for the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, and I work in the area of race relations. So I think I was thinking about COVID in a way that other people weren't necessarily, because we were ever aware of the racialization of this pandemic, particularly against Chinese and Asian people. We'd seen that happen around the world, and New Zealand indeed was not immune from that type of racism that we saw on the ground. So I think I was aware of it sort of from a professional perspective, and perhaps also from an intellectual perspective in terms of what was happening for COVID. But otherwise, for me, not being Asian or Chinese, life sort of just kind of went on as normal for me. In fact, I went to my first Mardi Gras in Sydney earlier this year, and that was just some weeks before we had a lockdown in New Zealand. And then because I'm quite a dramatic, fearful person, that when the lockdown happened here in New Zealand, I thought that I had COVID, and then hangover from my Christian upbringing. I'm still Christian now, but I suppose my legalistic and fear-based Christianity is that I thought that I had contracted COVID because I went to the Mardi Gras in Sydney. So I was worried about all those sorts of things.
Like a punishment.
Yeah. Anyway, so lockdown happened, and in New Zealand we went to lockdown as around all the world, and it was for those of us in the types of jobs that I'm in, a lot of people in the public service, we became even busier as we were supporting the COVID response across New Zealand. I work in human rights, so we were really interested in terms of what does the lockdown look like in terms of public health orders and other things. How is that going to infringe upon potentially people's human rights? So I think that was sort of my experience during COVID, and it was enjoyable, but I do say it was very busy. So busier than normal because we were working from home, and there just becomes no sort of separation or divide in terms of your own time and your professional time. But I did enjoy it in terms of it being quite slow. But I really caveat those comments by saying that I'm in such a position of privilege to actually comment on that the pace was slower in the world, because I absolutely understand that COVID itself was very testing and horrible for people who were already experiencing marginalisation or deprived, that was indeed compounded by the COVID experience. So I say those comments, knowing that I say that from the vantage point of being someone in privilege, comparatively. If I was to reflect in terms of my observations of what I see socially, we often talked about the new normal, and everyone was sort of talking about this rhetoric, after COVID, there needs to be a new normal, and I think those of us privileged, that would mean things like exercise and, better work-life balance. Businesses started to talk about the new normal as being different models and ways of working, such as Zoom, what we're doing now, remote ways of working. But I think for me, and I think professionally, but also socially, I think the very idea of the new normal then infers that the old way of doing things actually needed some change. And I think from where I'm at, it really recognised that the old way, that society's default settings were off. And I think what it did show is that there's a whole bunch of things that happened as per normal and business as usual prior to COVID, that COVID actually exposed that those things aren't cool. So here in New Zealand, for instance, I'm Pacific, I'm Samoan. The government sort of response, which is a lot of children to do work remotely, homework remotely, and also to isolate in your homes. Well, COVID actually revealed in New Zealand that for many Pacific families that isolating at home is really hard to do because they already live in overcrowded spaces with, maybe 2 or 3 rooms. And this notion of going to self-isolate somewhere in your house is actually quite a romantic notion. That one size fits all doesn't work for everyone. It meant that some children were having to go do their homework in their cars because of limited space in the house. It meant that some people didn't even go back to school. We've heard reports of children that had to give up school to actually go earn some, money for their family. And so I think when we talk about this rhetoric of the new normal, we really need to hold ourselves to that. In terms of, the least of these are the most deprived, the most marginalised. What now as society, the people that have the power, the duty bearers to actually help to redress and rectify those situations. I think it also revealed as well just how much racism underpins our very fibre and fabric of who we are as individuals and also as a society. And I think Asian Chinese people, though, having experienced discrimination all around the world and racism for a long time, a lot of it went unreported or unacknowledged. And I think what COVID did is actually brought to the fore that this has been an ongoing issue for them. So all those things, I think, remind us that, people like me can say COVID was a nice, quiet experience, but it's also a salient reminder of actually just how off we are as society. And now I think we need this continuous effort to redress and to rectify those things. And everyone needs to do that. What was also just fascinating to me, last thing, is actually just and I'm not black, so I say these comments very carefully, but within the context of the pandemic, the fact that Black Lives Matter happened, it was just kind of such a sort of a landmark type of moment that I think brought us to the awareness of just how ugly racism, discrimination, and this differential treatment towards some groups of our society is.
And there's something that happens. There's this sort of a magical, unmagical conjuring that happens when in times of tragedy, communities that are on the fringes or communities that are usually most vulnerable are even far more vulnerable in these times. You give it in Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, I mean, that not only you have the natural phenomena that people have to endure of this natural disaster, but then you have to endure the governmental disaster of the ineptitude, of the complete incompetence, and not only that, but the complete corruption. So then the communities who are mostly vulnerable are just left at a more dire place. And this is, I think, what's happened with, for example, with Black Lives Matters, is that for example, to use the United States as a reference point, which are the communities that are mostly affected by COVID? The BIPOC communities, people of color. The people of color are most affected.
Absolutely. And that, in fact, Angel, was a theme across the world. When you look at the BAME communities in the UK as well, in New Zealand, the need for health equity approaches is absolutely important, because if we don't address and mitigate against those conditions which are on the ground, the people who are most vulnerable will absolutely be the ones who are suffering by and large, who are also, by the way, the people that do not get access to the platforms necessarily in mainstream media and otherwhere, like places of power, to actually speak up on those issues. That's why it is so important that I think what COVID has done is actually revealed just how dysfunctional some of our systems are and how inept they are, as you already say, to address some of the challenges that society has had for decades and in some places centuries.
I also like the how this space allows me to get to know a little bit more about those who are joining me and sharing a little bit about their lives and their journey and their pilgrimages. And with this question, I'll get to know a little bit more about you, a little bit more
Mhm.
about, how you came about, how you have evolved, how you have pilgrimaged in life. And it's if you can share with me and with everyone watching, three experiences that you can refer to in your life, as experiences of transformation, whether they be instances, episodes, seasons, but that you in point of reflection now in hindsight can think back even to as early as you were a little kid. You can think back that these particular three moments were very determining in the person who you are before us now.
Awesome. Well, just for context and background, I'm Samoan, so from the Pacific Islands, but I was born in New Zealand. So my parents came here some time ago in search of a better life. And I'm the youngest of 4 children. Grew up in a very religious, very conservative home. Conservative, not only from the religious perspective, but conservative culturally as well. So, I think the successful missionization of the South Pacific is very evident today in that there's a whole bunch of us that come from the Pacific Islands that are just deeply Christian, deeply religious. So, those are the roots of colonization and the missionization. And it hasn't been all bad, so I'm not trying to paint it all as bad, but certainly there have been some things that have not been good. And I suppose in that context, me, knowing that I was gay growing up, and knowing that I was also Christian and knowing that I was Samoan, that was absolutely a conflict, growing up. So I don't think I necessarily felt it in my local church as much as the wider societal, stigma and discrimination that they have towards gay people. And the reason I didn't feel it in my own church is simply because it's a taboo subject, I think, for Samoans to actually bring up from the pulpit. So less that they weren't thinking about it, but rather that, culturally wouldn't support sort of like talking about, sex is just taboo. And also, I think it reflected the time that I grew up in. But if I can think of, but I grew up in a really religious, awesome home. Love it. Loved my church growing up. But certainly the faith that I learned was very legalistic, very performance-based. And so I think the first moment I just want to turn to is that when I was age 25, I had a hit rock bottom experience. I was a problem drinker. I would constantly get, pulled over, locked up in, the jail cell at the police place and all this sort of stuff. And, I think my life was absolutely out of control despite having a job and other things. Anyway, when I hit rock bottom, I actually ended up giving my life to Jesus. But I think because of my thinking of theology and religion, which was that was very performance-based, I was now 3 months sober, and I was very, very happy that that I had given up drinking. Because the kind of home and church that I went to, kind of religion or Christianity was defined to me as the things that I wasn't doing. So now that I wasn't smoking, now that I wasn't drinking, now that I wasn't whatever, this therefore made me a Christian. And I thought God was really happy with me and for me. So the formative experience came one Sunday night. Someone had given me this book called What's So Amazing About Grace by Philip Yancey. It was really popular in the 2000s, 90s. And there was a line in that book that said, there is nothing you can do to make God love you any more or any less. There is nothing you can do to make God love you any more or any less. And I remember it was a Sunday evening, and I read that again and again because I had been sober for 3 months by that point. And when I read that statement, it actually occurred to me that if that evening I decided to get off the plane and go get totally drunk, hammered, have crazy sex, blah, 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 that actually God's attitude towards me would not change. So firstly, 2 things happened. At first, I was really annoyed and angry. I was like, what on earth? Like these 3 months, what a waste of time. It means that his attitude towards me will not change. So I felt ripped off in one sense. And then I think the penny dropped and I was like, are you kidding? This means that this love that, transcended bigger love than me was always available to me from the beginning. Because I as a person, my personality is I find my value in what people think and consider me and perceive me. And then knowing that God actually just loves me regardless, even when I'm at my absolute worst, I just had this massive smile. And I honestly, it was shortly after 9/11. Had it not been for that, I would have jumped up and started screaming and been so happy, in terms of like, this is great news. But I think something went off in me, and I made a commitment that night to, I wanted to tell people about that love. And so, and surely enough, I went to my church on the weekend and asked all my mates, and we'd all go clubbing, drinking, blah, blah, blah together. And I asked them if they knew about this grace, that God had offered, and none of them did. And it made sense to me because we were just really operating out of this fear-based religion. So I think that was my first experience. And I think from that, I just wanted to let people know that they were acceptable, they were loved, and that God loved them. That was probably one of my first formative experiences. I do have another two, but I know I've been talking too long, so I didn't
No. That's fine. This is how things flow here. There's no talking too long. Keep on
Yeah.
going. Keep on going, mate. You're good. You're good.
Okay, probably the other experience then. Shortly after that, I was at Parachute Festival, a big Christian music festival here, the Southern Hemisphere. And I know that you had Bart Campolo speaking on your podcast a time ago, and his dad, Tony Campolo, was there. And I just have to say that when I was listening to this incredible Baptist preacher, he just became my hero, because as he was starting to talk about things like social justice and the need for Christians not just to be believers, like in terms of our political views, but rather how we demonstrate Christianity in the form of being like Jesus to people, and just his inclusive nature and his examples that he would give that really were following the examples of Jesus. Of stories like him being in a dingy diner in Honolulu at 3 a.m. and throwing a party for prostitutes. Those types of stories. There were just so many of them, and they just grabbed my heart, actually. And on the basis of that, the following year, through prayer and other stuff, I found myself in Australia, and I was working as a volunteer for an amazing, a beautiful family who are my family friends to this day. And I was working as a volunteer in their Christian music ministry. 2 years after that, I became a pastor, and now as a pastor in an area called Macquarie Fields, which was described as one of the most deprived, marginalised areas in Australia. It had just come out of a 3-day police riot between the police and the locals. And I had been asked by my denomination to be a school chaplain in that area, and then also to eventually start a church. And I do remember one Friday night, I was at the home of one of the church members who's now passed away. She was a single parent, had just the most traumatic life, I would say, like on so many levels. And that Friday night, my cousin Tina and I were at her house with her daughter, and they'd made us the most beautiful meal. I was vegetarian, so she made me this beautiful vegetarian meal. But I was ever aware that as we were sitting there, that she had spent a lot of hers and her daughter's money on feeding me that night. Wow. And she also apologised because we could feel a draft coming through the window, and she'd said that the Housing Commission haven't responded to their calls as a family to fix the draft that had been coming in for wow. some years. And I remember that Friday night, I was just sitting there, I just felt so humbled and in awe of this family who were just literally giving me, this privileged person, their best. And I just kind of felt like there's a quote in my faith tradition, my denomination, where the person says, if you ever wanted what it was like to sit at the sit at the foot of Jesus, to sit on the hilltops and to listen to him speak, you needn't wonder anymore. In fact, the footprints of Jesus can be found at every hospital bedside, every derelict alleyway, anywhere there is need. Those are the footprints of Jesus. And I just kind of felt like it was one of those moments. I wasn't trying to be voyeuristic, but I just kind of felt like this is what I've been called to do. And I felt humbled, and I was really glad to have been in Australia for 10 years and to be part of that ministry. And I think just wanting an inclusive space in churches, not an inclusive in terms of like the LGBT thing now. I know that to be inclusive. I'm talking about class now, I'm talking about churches where people who are whatever they've come from, that they would feel comfortable there, that the things that have been said from the front, that the people who are in the mix in the church look like them, that they don't feel like they're second-class citizens. And I think that really, really, really informed me in my life. And the last formative experience I'll just point to is that I'd been a pastor now for 10 years, and I was at my birthday 4 years ago. At that time, it was my 40th birthday, and I had been trying to be, in the background, I'd been trying to be straight. I'd undergone conversion therapy, a lot of other things, and I got to my 40th birthday, and still a pastor then, and I had many people around me, lots of friends in New Zealand. I had hakas done for me in New Zealand. That's a sign of like, a really beautiful sort of tribute to you. So there was a lot of people that respected me and loved me around me, but I actually looked around the room and I felt really lonely. And it occurred to me that I was 40 years old. I'd been trying to be straight for a long time now, but to no avail. And I looked around the room and I thought, this is your plight in life now. This is the rest of your life. You're going to, like, despite, being youngish and despite having potential for family and relationship, that because of what I believed that would be, I wouldn't be able to have that. And I got very, very sad. So it was my 40th birthday. I should have been happy, but in fact, I was really sad. But I think what happened then is that started to open up a whole bunch of questions in my mind about, is this right? And how can this be? And I think that eventually just led to me eventually coming out to myself, first of all, then to my friends and family, and then last year publicly in a column in the Sydney Morning Herald that went further afield. I had a coming out essay, and I did that because here in New Zealand and Australia rather, there was a famous rugby player who was Christian, and also Pacific, who spoke about gays going to hell. And every time I was going into Facebook, I was seeing just the most horrible comments being said about the gay community. And I was just so worried about Pacific young people that I felt like I wanted to speak up and say something and to offer a counter narrative, because I was really becoming concerned that, and he's not to blame because he's really just symptomatic and a product of his environment, the same environment that I grew up in. But I was really deeply concerned that it would force another generation or two back into the closet. And then, not only that, I was actually concerned of people's mental health and well-being. And sure enough, when it came out, a university chaplain of a secular university in Sydney reached out to me and said, we needed this type of discourse, this type of conversation in the ether, and pointed to the fact that 2 Pacific people had suicided to this very issue. And if only this type of article or conversation was happening in the public sphere, it might make them think twice about that, or at least allow for a more informed conversation. So that has really become like the other big formative, experience in my life.
Just a bit of a disclaimer here. And just to give context, I pilgrimaged within the Christian atmosphere, to call it that way, during most of my life. I would say maybe 3/4 of my life. I was born into it. My mom was baptized when she was pregnant of me, so I even had it before I was even born. No longer I'm a Christian. I'm an agnostic atheist. But every time I hear someone talk about Jesus and talk about the historical Jesus and I can't help but get excited, because if there's anything I have legitimately renounced is the institution, and it's the colonizational or the colonization type of sequestering of the God or of the Christ or of anything that has some intrinsic value, and it's now then used in order to control or oppress people. And I hear you talk about grace, and I think back and I think back, and I say I think back because I have to think back to when I encountered it. But I think that now in my life there is so much of that still presence in my life. Like my desire to want to get to know people, I understand, and I have to confess that it has something to do with that element of grace, the element of that you find yourself in this like, whoa, this is holy shit, like this is heavy, this is I can't believe I did not know this for so long.
Absolutely. And Angel, I'll just say it's a complete disservice, I suppose, to Jesus and to religion that the church at large and other religions have now, the sum total of being religious is a whole bunch of rules that effectively have been used against lots of people, and particularly marginalized groups of people. But in fact, this grace, this idea that, mate, you're okay, and you're special, and irrespective of whatever's happened to you, like you are you have intrinsic worth and value just because. Imagine if the church was able to, to have that on tap. It would be a different, the value add to the world would be different. I think the types of conversations and the way that we roll our eyes about the church and religion, in my opinion, are warranted and merited because of the very fact that they've neglected these things that that could help so many people. Just in terms of your own mental health and well-being, it would be just an incredible gift, to offer people. Yeah.
And I think, I mean, you speak about your ancestry, about being dating back to Samoa, and I think about my ancestry in Puerto Rico, and the eclectic mixology there, with obviously with the colonization, and obviously our indigenous Taínos and our Africanos and Africanas that came from Africa, from Mother Africa, enslaved, and then you have this beautiful thing that happened, but this beautiful thing that happened also happened with a lot of blood, and it happened with a lot of horrific things. So it's not to overly decorate on that, but I think that
absolutely
some of our, to not say all, but as I've touched a little bit into indigenous cultures and indigenous religious practices and indigenous spirituality, it seems to me that to use myself as an example, that the Taino Indians, or the Taino indigenous people in Puerto Rico, had far more in tune conceptualizations of gender, of that whole hierarchical patriarchal nonsense did not exist within that culture. So then you have this basically this invasion. And you have this invasion that brings Christianity into this culture. So then you have a counter Christ-like representation of Christianity, that in their indigenous practices they were exemplifying a far more characterization of Christ, in it that they were living, in it that they were connected to the world, in it that they were connected to the earth, to nature. They knew the perfect balance. They knew that they could not exploit this but then out come these people that had different ambitions. And I think that there's a continuation with different cultures that is almost identical, that same dynamics.
Absolutely. In New Zealand, not all Pacific people are Christian, but there is a large majority who are Christian or were raised Christian. In New Zealand as well, amongst the Pacific population, there's also a number of, sort of academics as well, and people that have been, been through university. So a lot of these same people are very familiar with concepts of decolonization, of the academy, or of health, of education. And yet, I would just love to say to some of those people, well, actually, we need to do the same to religion in the Bible now. You absolutely understand it in these spheres of life, in terms of education, in terms of health, blah, blah, blah. The Bible is the next cab off the rank, or religion is the next cab off the rank to actually decolonize now. I always say when I used to preach, and, I used to get a lot of laughs, but it would get a lot of laughs because it resonated. I would say that Jesus, when I was preaching in Samoan churches, I would go, Jesus was not, my faith tradition is Seventh-day Adventist, was not a Seventh-day Adventist Samoan, because we really fashion him after us, don't we? When I'm in Australia, I go, Jesus was not an Australian, In America, when you see the conflation of politics and religion, Jesus was not a white American. And so, and essentially, people get scared of these words like decolonization, but that's all what decolonization is. It's actually starting to dissect and, what is cultural, what is and then also recognizing the good. I always just quote to James 1:17, which is this verse that goes, every good and perfect gift comes from God above. And yet, we've offered our concept of God, those of us in religion, Christianity, is so small. And so in other words, unless it comes with these key words, key terminologies, did they say Jesus though, that we fail to recognize that God is working everywhere. And I have to say, when I started my job at the Human Rights Commission, being a former pastor, it was an eye-opener for me in so many regards, because I always considered myself kind of liberal and progressive and open-minded. And then in my job, I interact with people from different religions all the time. And I would just say it was mind-blowing to me. I feel so embarrassed to say this, but it was mind-blowing to me just to see people of all these different faiths just living their faith so beautifully, So if I can just give the example, like when the Christchurch terrorist attacks happened last year, March 15, whereby 51 Muslim people died while worshipping in peace in their mosques, and many more injured, that I had the privilege to accompany our Chief Commissioner and another colleague on the ground in Christchurch to see where we could support or just to be a presence on the ground. And I just met the most amazing Muslim people. And when I would look at them in the way that they would respond to this terrible tragedy that you don't even have a category for in your head in terms of the violence, everything else for. Yeah. And yet their grace, when they would interact with you, the time that they would give you, the kindness in which they would communicate with you. And I would literally look at them and I'd think to myself, my gosh, if I wasn't so, deeply involved in my own faith, Christianity, because it works for me as a framework, my vision of Christianity that I like for myself anyway. But I would look at them and I would say, my gosh, I would love to become what you are if my life looked the way that you are demonstrating now. Yeah. And then when I'd interact with later on, like with friends from Baha'i faith, and I'd meet so many of them, and every time I interacted with them, I was like, I want what you have. Yeah. So, and I absolutely understand that, these things aren't tied to religion. There are good people everywhere. And I think the disservice we have done, we have limited like God to our brand and our version of him. And it's a disservice to God, whatever you want to call it in your own terms of reference, but also in terms of having these really special ways that we can interact and love one another, as opposed to seeing this, what we're seeing, in America and all around the world, where there's this complete distrust and disregard for each other. And it's a tragedy, yeah.
I have a question for you, and I'm going to give a little bit of context as to my life. I in past tertulias and these conversations, I mentioned about I like to illustrate, this display of dominoes lined up together. As you knock one, the others fall down. And I think about my life and what dominoes have fallen down that were very firmly standing up, and that they represented things that I thought were just, hardwired, and they were meant to be like that forever and ever, amen. And I think of dominoes falling down, and I think of that because it's that continuous effect, that one will lead to another, and then that other, it is an ongoing thing. It is not going to stop. And I think about my life, what that first domino was. And I would like to get to know what your first domino was. My first domino was, and it was actually happening in Australia, actually. It was around the time I met you. And I had picked up this book called Messy Spirituality by Mike Yaconelli, from founder of Youth Specialties, who I actually had the chance of meeting his widow, his wife, some years ago.
Wow.
And we became really good friends. I mean, she's just...
Wow.
Formidable person, just a person of grace, and she's just that person who he talked about in those books. She's just that crazy, amazing person. And I think of that first domino for me was the LGBT issue. For me, it was the LGBT issue and I remember being with because I studied at Hillsong. I remember being with my housemates, and I was already hearing it. I'm good friends. I don't know if you know of Jay Baker, son of Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. He's a pastor. He's a gay affirming pastor. Right. That marked a point in his life too, because he lost everything after he became affirming. But he's a good friend of mine. And at that time, I mean, I just knew him from afar. The church he was running, but he was starting to talk about this, and I started problematizing it. But it was hard. I mean, all the patriarchal wiring here was like, that's not so good. And I wasn't a hard turn to burn, but it was hard. Because then I was thinking to myself, oh my God, if I'm thinking this, am I gay? And then if I'm gay, that's heavy because I'm renouncing to my heteronormativity, and that's a big thing, you know? But then when I finally was able to knock it down, wow, wow,
Mm.
wow, wow, because I stopped sabotaging relationships into how I related with the people, and it wasn't a oh well, I'm gonna relate right now with a heterosexual human, and I'm gonna relate out with a homosexual human. It blurred the lines,
Mm.
and I started seeing humans for what humans are, not for who they sleep in, not for how they do it, because holy crap, like who the hell is that? How you convey relationship with one another? All the while I'm thinking about how people do. It's such a frivolous thing to hang relationships on. So when I got over that, it was just like magic. So for you, I know you had your coming out moment, but I don't know if there's anything before that that you feel was like a first domino that you can point to that it was a big one, and you could feel it. I know you commented on grace, and maybe you can maybe touch on that. Maybe it's not, but maybe to the specificity of a particular thing, maybe a theological premise or something, but that you felt it was a gigantic thing that was falling down.
Yeah, probably one that doesn't seem that profound, but I think was helpful to me all the way through my journey. And that is when I first became a Christian and gave my life to Jesus, I had people would call it a privilege, but it didn't feel like that I got to be on my church board in my church, in my Samoan church. And I love all of those people, my elders and all the people that, I was raised around. But you got a first-hand glimpse of church politics. And I remember being a fresh and new, naive Christian. I was like, what's going on here? Like all these people that call themselves Christian, and I could just see all this power grabbing, and all this, like, this is my local church, and all this like politicking. And I think that experience just solidified for me that there is God and then there's the church. And I think knowing that really early on, I think it allowed me to take with a grain of salt and to question like things that I was taught. And I think I had that framework in my mind, like, okay, that's cool. You're saying that. How does this line up against what I can see what God is doing? And so I think all the way through my ministry and in my life, I think I was always applying that question, which I think ended up being super useful to me, I think the big block for me, I suppose, was the big block, as I said it, is when I started to think, because I've been trying to be so straight for so long. And by the way, when people hear this about me, they always go, oh, it's not just conversion therapy courses. It's about a pursuit of holiness. And I was like, yeah, welcome to my life. I was trying to pursue holiness on another level that you wouldn't even know about. Okay, so like, oh, totally. But also just like, so I refer to the technical courses that I took, but certainly I was trying to do all the things right by, praying and giving myself to God, etc. So I think the other big block for me was actually learning and knowing that that you couldn't actually be straight, that the science did not support it, that also evidence on the ground did not support it. So I think a big thing happened for me was when I'd found out that Exodus that closed down in 2009. For those that don't know, Exodus was a big sort of parachurch organization, sort of an umbrella for all sort of ex-gay ministries that try to convert or move people towards heterosexuality. When I learned in my journey that that when they not only did they close down in 2009, by the time I was a hard-up pastor and Christian at that time, and I thought to myself, look at them, they're compromising to the world's standards. Like, what about people like me that are trying to do it the best, and they've taken away any hope that we might have, blah, blah, blah. And then to learn that the founder actually says that 99.8% of the people that profess to be heterosexual, in fact, return to being gay. And so when I heard that statistic, I was like, gosh, not only, so the fact that I'm unable to try to, enact this by myself in terms of being straight, actually the science doesn't support it, and neither does the experience of the ground of tens of thousands of people like me. And which was such a it was really horrible to hear, because like, why didn't I know this earlier? Why didn't the people tell me that, that this is contested, this idea of? So I think that was the first big block for me. And then I started to make me think, well, I can actually now look at the Bible not only from a theological perspective, but also from a ethical perspective and a psychosocial sort of perspective as well. So I think to this end, the works of people like David Gushee, his questions of the ethics in the church, and the church having, continued to promulgate and promote this idea that you could be straight or that it's a sin, was a real big block for me. And I think that started for me to unpack other stuff, I think what was also helpful is just being a person of color in the church as well, because I always just knew that when I was hearing things from the front, I was like, yeah, that works for you, it doesn't work for me. So I was always looking at things through that lens as well. And then I think that's what helped me really understand in terms of, how the patriarchy has been supported by the Bible, but actually when you investigate the Bible, it's actually much more supportive of a much more inclusive approach towards women. And I just thought, well, this absolutely leads to the fact that because the people who have had the power, who interpret it and who promote these views are all the people that have everything to gain from, entrenching further like these systems of privilege. So, when we're looking at the debate around the world in terms of statues falling down, there's this big really, this conversation is about whose histories, whose narratives are we prioritizing, are we valuing, are we celebrating, are we having holidays around? And every single time it's going to be the same group of people. So I think all that sort of stuff has been really useful to my own unlearning, to use a woke term, my deconstruction, or to my, finding some semblance and stabilizing of my own faith, as well.
I had a friend, good friend of mine, tell me how he was from here, from the U.S. He was handing out. This is pre-elections, because now we can refer to it as, or we can refer to it as, or we can refer to it as the Trumpian times, which we're now still in. I don't know if we can. I don't know if it's technically post-Trump era now, but he was handing out just some voting material to vote, and then he went to this house, and he was literally almost assaulted to the ground of these people that didn't know him, but they completely constructed this idea to the most demonizing extremes you can make it, to basically cuss them the hell out of the front yard. And basically, like, in a nutshell, so I asked him, my good friend's name is Dylan. I'm like, Dylan, just think about the amount of fear that a person must be living in to react to that like that, to cuss you out, to think that in that delivery they are redeeming themselves, they are acting out in some righteous way. And this is not to justify, to not condemn. This is just a little exercise of analysis. I give you a little bit analytical, but to go into how many of us in the human experience have succumbed to that. And then there's many reasons for lack of education, ignorance. You have a system that perpetuates that. There's many reasons. But the reality of the fact is that a person who's living like that they're not living a healthy life. This is not about being condescending. This is about the fact that you cannot possibly be living a healthy life. If your instinctive reaction to a person who you don't know, because of this formulated idea you have of them, and I want to use that as a bit of an example to talk about decolonization, because that's what colonization is you take the worst assumptions of something and you run with that, and you institute your flag of superiority, and you say, here I am, I have the truth, I know what's best for you. And that's how it's been forever and ever. Amen. So colonization doesn't just look like, oh, let's look back at the 15th century. No. Colonization is alive and well. And for example, I think of the most prosperous of churches. I think of, for example, I hate to name drop, but I think of a Hillsong, which is representative of many other churches. And I think of how there is a sense of, oh my God, even in my experience that I didn't even know I was going through, a sense of untouchability, the untouchabilities, of those in the top. And this isn't just Hillsong. This is this is the ecosystem that's made. And I want to ask you, like, how do you, like, how do you, in a humanized way? Because I mean, we are talking about people. We're talking about we. This is not about like picketing or not picketing, but we do have to problematize, because especially when there are people on the receiving end that are getting the rotten end of the stick, and that you feel that there's people who are suffering through it, that they feel that suicide is the alternatives. We need to urgently problematize, because passive aggressive discourse is aggression and it is violence. So how do you begin problematizing certain discourses that you find in churches like Hillsong, which is so common, passive aggressive discourses, and almost you find almost a certain level of papal infallibility, because you have the main pastor, and you can't question that main pastor. You don't have that approximation of like really legitimate just questioning. I never experienced that in many of the churches of being like, hey, we're gonna have an open round of, you're gonna question me. No, because then you have that conversation between God and that has to do with conversation. So in a nutshell, like I mean, in a nutshell, for me to resume this whole rant, but you can speak as much as you want. How do you problematize these spaces? And if you're not a part of them, how do you begin that conversation of healthily problematizing these spaces that seem to perpetuate the status quo? And they don't have any problem. They're okay with doing charity. We're doing charity, but we're not questioning the very premise and reason for why these groups are perpetuated the way they are. So how do we begin?
Yeah. I think this is a human rights approach, but I think it's a very sensible approach as well. And that is that we focus on the systems that allow for this to happen. You know, where within these systems are accountabilities and opportunities for those who are at the top to be questioned in terms of their practice, or to allow questions to come from the floor for those who are on the bottom, and allow them to reach all the way to the top and actually to be heard and also responded to as well. So when I often get asked, like, you know, what's your advice to you know, young gay Christians who are in a church who are struggling, there's a lot of things I could say to them, but I always then defer that question actually to the religious leaders of systems who can influence. And I always say the onus should not be on the person who has been marginalized, discriminated against, to try to affect change. They can't, you know. The onus actually needs to be on the systems of those in power. So then I would ask the churches, what are you doing? What is your response in your church, in your denomination, in your local parish, in the system at large? What is your response to the fact that young gay people, rainbow people, are walking out the back door, and no one has, in many cases, no one even has to ask them to? They instinctively know that they are not welcome, either through their own reading of the Bible or through all the crap that they've heard over the many years of people saying homophobic comments, blah, blah, blah. So many will walk out the back door, or they'll walk out because someone has given them advice to try to turn straight, but to no effect, you know. So my question is then, to the systems, to the powers be, what are you going to do about that? Because we can't actually put that on the people themselves. The other thing I would also say is that that we need just to be honest. Churches need to be honest. Like, I used to go on to Hillsong. I would really enjoy it, and it's a cool place, you know, in terms of worship and other stuff. But we need to be honest, because otherwise people mistaken seemingly inclusive spaces or places that seem very friendly and say nice things from the front. So we get confused because I, as a rainbow person, might be welcomed in. That I think they know me and they like me and they accept me. But in fact, what I would say to churches is be transparent with your policy, please, at the beginning, you know. I've heard some gay rainbow people liken it to being on a really bad date where you're courting your church for like 3-4 months, and then you ask to do a prayer or a song, and then they go, no, I can't. You can't, because even though we've accepted you, even though we've gone to coffee and lunch, and even though we're doing life together, you actually aren't allowed to because of our interpretation of the scripture. So then I would then say, churches, please just have an honest position, be transparent about your policy, leave it out for everyone to see, because what that will do is it will allow those of us on the outside to know whether we're going to invest unnecessary burden and investment into trying to get to know you, only to find out that in the end, ultimately, we're going to be rejected if we don't change according to what you want us to. I think the other thing of a clear, transparent policy statement will also do is actually just to reveal just how ugly what we're saying is. Like, if you look back to, the civil rights movement era in America, and then also in South Africa, the segregated spaces where there were once signs like whites only, no coloureds or no blacks allowed. Can we please actually just have those types of, if we're honest about where we're at, it actually starts a new starting point for our conversation. Hopefully churches that put up the policy statements will then actually start to think, oh my gosh, this is not a good look, is it? This is yucky that, that there's a whole cohort or whole group of society that will not be allowed in. And I think that's where the conversation needs to start, because the conversation always starts in the same place where it's always started. That leads to really trite conversation. And that is things like, but what does the Bible say? And then we, debate around these 6 verses. You'd think there'd be 6 books, not 6 verses, that are including the participation and involvement and meaningful engagement and belonging of, rainbow people within the church. I think stop that as a starting point, because guess who always wins and gets privilege from that? The people that always have, the people that hold the pen, who preach from the pulpit, who have every power to discard your experience or your testimony. And let's instead start it over here. There's a whole group of people that are walking out and have been excluded from our fellowship, as we understand it, because of interpretation of scripture. Now let's talk about that. That's a much more honest starting point, in my opinion, and it actually will allow for a much more nuanced, quality, and deep conversation in this issue.
I can't help but think of what would a church or an organization, but let me just focus on church. What would a church look like or feel like that I would love to attend? And I think, and the one sole thing I think of is of real conversations, like real conversations without cringiness, without fearing that the person who you're interacting with might say something that's going to make you feel uncomfortable, because you're already okay to be in that space, and that space is uncertainty of how how was your week, what did you learn, what did you not learn, what were your disappointments, what really pissed you off, but when you have a conjuring experience in the church, just to give an example, because every church is different, of this sort of showmanship, of this sort of spectacle, that is very effective, because we are already almost predisposed to this Hollywood driven scenario, that to
Absolutely.
me it would minister so, and I'm borrowing a Christian word, it would minister to me deeply for a pastor to be like, today I had the worst week and I feel like shit, and I don't believe today.
Yeah.
To me that would speak loads of what the church then would mean to embody, to have that solidarity,
Absolutely. Yeah. When I was, my 2 churches that I pastored at in Sydney and in Wellington, one of my good friends, her name is Emma, she approached me in the first church, and she wasn't raised Adventist, but she said, how about we have a testimony time every week? And I go, what do you mean? She goes, well, where people can come up and they can share. And I think because of being a pastor and also the denomination that I grew up in, I immediately was scared. It's like, well, what would they say?
I know, right?
So do I
Associating it.
get to control it? What would happen? Like, what if they say something that's,
What are they allowed to
Anyway,
say?
yeah, absolutely. What if it's not the party line? Blah, 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 And needless to say, we went live with it. It was just one of the best, most amazing things that ever happened. I remember just the most incredible, beautiful experiences of faith. People would go up. I remember the time she was struggling, young person was struggling with, at that time, an eating disorder and asked for prayer because was going to be admitted to hospital with the eating disorder. And, young girl, and then another friend who was in the audience, who's a big burly Māori guy, my mate Ray. He shouts out from the back and he goes, "Oh, girl, I wish I had your problem. I eat too much." Anyway, so I know this may sound really dismissive, but the whole church laughed, and I think it was a moment of just unity. Like, you've got your issue, I've got my issue.
Cutting
I
the
remember another
tension.
time. Absolutely. I remember another time a young man went up, and he said, "Look, I'm being evicted from my home. Can you please pray for me?" And then I remember another man who at that time was living in his car, and despite our efforts to try to get him into a house he didn't want to, he wanted to live in his car. And he shouted out from the back as that testimony was happening, goes, "Well, if you need somewhere to stay, the passenger seat's available in my car." So we weren't
phenomenal.
like looking down upon people's stuff. I think what we were trying to do is just actually normalize and make okay and safe that as you bear your heart and your soul and that you're one in prayer for this, please do not be embarrassed. We've all got our own struggles, and I may be high this week and up and life is working well for me, but next week maybe not. And what it did do, it just became people's favorite part of church, because you would see an active faith, from week to week, bad stuff, good stuff. I do laugh though, because in my church in Wellington, we instigated it. I laugh because when we announce the time, what happens is when people who are not used to this, when they visit our church, they go up and then they hear the word testimony, and then they go up and they share, and no disrespect, but they share the same story that they've been sharing like for 20 years. They go,
Yeah.
"My life was really bad, and then God came into my life and did this." End of story. And they sit down and we're like, "Okay," we all clap. But like, we're just talking about from last week to this week, man. You know what I mean? Like, where did God move, or where could we not see him move? And I think that's the service we've done, is that we've made God very much around the church, very much around these sort of events, as opposed to organically the ebb and flow of life and what happens. And if one more thing I could just say is that my fear that I gave when around the testimony is very much what you were saying around your friend that went to the house and then got cussed out. It's so sad to me that the Bible should promote, and religion should promote, free, beautiful living, in terms of living in who you are and just the absolute confidence. You've got something big and powerful within you. And one of the things I would always say as a pastor, like, the very spirit that rose Jesus from the dead is in you. All of that, like, that should absolutely promote like this, just confidence in and an embracing of life and an acceptance of people, as opposed to this fear-based narrative that we're fallen into, and this idea that we have to try to convert everyone to be like us and to accept or say the words that we're saying, these trite sort of expressions of, I wouldn't even call them faith, of religion, So I just feel like, man, church, can we please review, like, in terms of what we are teaching and the type of faith and religion we're passing on to those underneath us. It's not cool. And no wonder, the world does not take the witness credibly. No wonder they continue to walk out the back doors of our church in every context, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to. I think it was I think it was Mark Twain that said, totally going to paraphrase it, but a great deal of education consists in unlearning, and it's in how we will ourselves to that, to do that. How, and I think that's a good mantra to perhaps have. Like, how much am I willing myself to unlearn? How much am I How much am I willing myself to unlearn? How much am I letting other people's stories affect me? Like, by that I mean, like, how much are we listening to one another, rather than having this sort of like active listening, getting ready to respond, and but to really tune into the awkwardness of not knowing and being, wow, this is really blowing me away. I don't know what to say. I
Absolutely.
don't know how to dive
Yeah.
into that space. Do you I mean, right now you're not pastoring per se, right?
Yeah, no. So I attend my local church that I used to be a pastor at. I've got the most amazing pastor, an amazing church. They support me. Our local parish is very inclusive and loving and accepting. Although the denomination, just because of who they are, don't have an inclusive policy position. But my local parish is very kind and loving to me. I never feel excluded. There, one of my friends, is also gay and attends the church as well. So we feel very safe there. But no, I'm not pastoring.
And I asked this because do you feel a pastor?
Oh, it's really funny. I do. I think it just slips out of you. And one thing I would just say is I just feel like that I've been able to do a different type of ministry now. Working at the commission where I'm at. Remember, a pastor reached out to me last year after my article went out and said, Andre, I feel like you preached more in those 700 words than you have in all your years of ministry. You've been able to reach more people, and to get to more people. But I tell you what I do miss, though, and it was funny because some of my friends, Diverse Church here in New Zealand, they're doing a conference next year called Awaken Conference, and I was really lucky enough for them to ask me to be one of the keynote speakers there. And I was like, oh, cool. I was really excited about it. But just that very morning, before I went to meet them, I was thinking to myself, man, I really miss doing those sermons like, you're awesome, God loves you, you're special, you're amazing. Because every time I get to speak now, sort of in a religious, quasi-religious context, it's always quite about this type of issue. The types of discussions we've had, they're very technical, they're very theoretical, and sometimes, they're debatey type sort of stuff. And I was like, man, I just miss telling someone, that they're really special to God, like from the front. Anyway, so when we sat down, they said, look, we'd love for you to be a keynote. There's going to be sort of a political sort of technical session on the first day. But then the rest, and this is what they said, and it just made me laugh, and some people might roll their eyes, but I don't care. They said, basically, we want to make it like Hillsong Conference, but for gays. And I was like, I want that, I want somewhere that I can go to and just feel encouraged, tough, man. And I would just love to go somewhere and go, hey, look, you're doing it tough. Guess what? You're not alone. Guess what? The scripture has this to encourage you through this time. So when they told me, I was like, mate, this is like an answer to prayer, because something comes in me when I get to I don't know, it's just a part of my DNA, I suppose. So, and just on that regard, it just makes me sad that that many people who have a similar gift aren't able to exercise it, in an environment anymore because there's no safe places or places that will allow them to do that, which is another disservice in terms of the gifts that we've all been given, for ministry or for helping people. Yeah.
I think I maybe not in the same specific way, but I think I kind of asked Bart a similar question, Bart Campolo. And for those who don't know Bart Campolo, he used to be this alongside with his dad Tony, but basically a preacher, and he traveled all along, and now he's basically an atheist. But that longing for connection, I don't think has abandoned him. I think. And this is just me theorizing a bit, and I use it myself as an example. I think I look back myself 20 years, 15 years, 10 years ago. I don't think I have changed that much in the sense of course, there's things that I've learned, and with the years, experiences, the heartaches, the brick walls. But in substance, I think I've always tried to be as genuine as I can. I think I've always tried to be as real and as honest as I can. So I don't think I've changed all that much. When I was pilgrimaging in Christianity, I was trying to be a genuine Christian. I was trying to even problematize within the quarters of where I was at. And now I'm not all that different. Of course, I'm not standing on tables preaching anymore as I used to do back in the day. But the essence, I think, hasn't changed all that much. So in your regards, as you have transitioned, do you feel like, from the days that you were giving it the best of your attempts to dehomosexualize yourself and to where you are now, And this is not for me to try and say, well, let's replicate Angel's story. No. But how different, how similar do you feel from both scenarios, or thrice or four or whatever? But I use that as an example because I would imagine. I mean, just to think of, so it must be a drastic difference of places to be in, to kind of like
Yeah.
be in that
Um,
sorrow, or in
yeah.
that drowning in the cup of water, and that drowning, and then you kind of come out to a different place. So
Yeah. Yeah. No, Angel, I absolutely relate to what you're saying. In this respect, like I think uh, for me, because I had that grace experience with God where I knew that He loved me, I was always wanting to, when I was a pastor, even when I wasn't a pastor, just build inclusive spaces where people felt welcome and that they knew that they were loved and accepted by God. What happened for me when I eventually accepted myself as gay is that I had now applied the belief and the rhetoric for everyone else. I now applied to Andre. So now I was saying that includes you, Andre, on the issue of homosexuality. You are loved, desirable, accepted, celebrated, adored by God. Like I would say that to everyone, no matter what the situation was. I would deal with people who were, ex-prostitutes, ex-gang members, just all the things that society, I suppose, thinks are bad, and people who have just gone through some yucky stuff in life. And I would always just point them to what I believe God was, my version of God as the scripture interpreted it. And I think when I accepted myself as gay, I had now accepted that now applied to me. The whole time I was in pastoral ministry, I never once from the front or privately ever suggested to anyone that they should try to be straight at all, because I just knew I couldn't do it. So there was no way that I was going to prescribe that to anyone else. So I had taken this burden on myself. And then, I had then just accepted it for myself at the end of that, Angel. So I agree with you. I think I'm more authentically what I always was earlier now. Like now, it's just more now congruent and reflected in my own practice of myself and my own self-belief. But this is always a question I know when I'm speaking to gay people and gay Christian people. It's like people are like, when did you come out? And they always now preface it by, actually, I came out to myself first. It's that realization to yourself first and then publicly. And sometimes getting around to that one of yourself is the hardest. I think if you getting there is the first step. So yeah.
it's interesting that it would happen that way, but I hear you, and it makes a lot of sense. It speaks into the irony of life. I have two more questions, Andre. Um, what things are you thankful for as a Samoan, born in New Zealand, as a homosexual man, as a yeah, like what are you thankful for as a person who has as a rich Samoan history? What has that given you? I want, because I
Yeah.
want to take some time to focus on your heritage, on focus on your sense of identity, sense of cultural identity. Um, so what are you thankful for as a Samoan? Even if you might sound risk of sounding arrogant or whatnot, it's like when people hear me talking about my country, they're like, man, like, but to boast that up, to think deeply about the gifts that your culture and your heritage has bestowed upon you. To focus on that, then we focus on that. But just as a Samoan man born in New Zealand.
So I'm going to answer the question in a roundabout way, but a couple of months ago, I went with awesome organisation here in New Zealand called Inside Out. They do a lot of work inside schools to make schools more inclusive of LGBT, rainbow people. And my friend Bronwyn asked me to go to a school that had a high Pacific population, high Samoan, high Pacific. I think probably the school's sitting around 80% brown, high Pacific Polynesian population there. And the reason they asked me to go out is because of my experience as a former pastor. So I started to share with the teachers, and I reflected, like, and I'm going to answer your question, but I said, when you ask these Pacific young people what are the most important things in their life, they are bound to say, I'll predict to you, because the research shows this, that it's their family, their culture, and their faith. Their family, their culture, and their faith. Those are the things that just make them who they're so proud of. In New Zealand, Pacific people experience, next to Tangata Whenua Māori, who are the Indigenous people of New Zealand, experience some of the worst social outcomes in New Zealand across health, education, you name it. But in the interesting situation of Pacific people, despite experiencing this worst social outcomes across many indicators, they are also likely to report high levels of optimism and resilience. And so despite life being crap for us in so many regards, due to lots of things, violence, poverty, blah, 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 children and people themselves are likely to say, I love my family, I love my culture, and I love my faith. Those things, so we call those resilience or protective factors. It's the same with me as well, all those things, faith, my family, and my culture. But then I challenged the teachers and I said to them, if these are the protective factors for every Pacific young person, I want you now to consider the situation of the Pacific rainbow person who, again, loves these three things that are going for them in their lives, their faith, their culture, and their family. Now you consider the rainbow person who is now in the closet, knows that they are rainbow, but is afraid to come out. Guess what? Those three same forces, faith, culture, and family, which are meant to be the protective resilience factors, are going to be the very same factors that are going to prevent them from coming out, because they're going to be too embarrassed to bring shame, stigma, and judgment upon their faith, their culture, and their family. And so I said, gosh, what a terrible position they're in, right? Because the only things going for them in this society, which is sort of working against them on so many levels, now those three forces can be used against them if they don't have good mentoring support, another alternative way of doing life, that those are the very three things that are going to keep them from accepting themselves, And so then I challenged the teachers and I said, therefore, school is such a sacred setting, isn't it? In terms of being a place by which teachers and significant adults can mentor and support children to fully be who they are, because of these these factors that are working against them in this regard. So to answer your question in a long way, those three things are the same with me. My parents had passed away 10 and 20 years ago. We didn't have the perfect life growing up. We weren't rich and stuff like that. We had the experience that a lot of Pacific people experience. We got hidings and, we sometimes didn't know where our next, food was going to come from. Our power would get routinely cut. But my parents just did everything they did to try to give us a really good education and give us good values in life. And I'm so grateful for that, in terms of my, growing up in the church. I think when I became a pastor, when I get to do public speaking in other places, I know that growing up in the church and having those formative experiences, similar to like people who could sing in the church, I can't sing, but I certainly know that, I was raised by a village, to be able to do a lot of the things that I get to do now. And then in terms of my, my faith and my culture, all those things, just I feel very privileged and special. I feel lucky to be a Samoan, like we come from such a small island comparatively to other populations around the world. There's so few of us, and yet so many of us. I can look around my own society and even globally and just look to, a number of Samoans who have done some really special and wonderful things, and it makes us feel very proud, Also just feel proud that I'm Samoan, also to be part of, the wider Pacific Polynesian group of other cultures as well, and just have those shared experiences of just love and reciprocity, service, all those things that just make me very proud to be who I am, which is ironic because growing up, when you grow up in a mainstream society, those are the very things that you feel very embarrassed about, and you just wish you blended in with everyone else. And, only when you go to uni or grow up or, you just find out, oh my gosh, those were the best things about me.
Entirely. I hear you and I relate so much to that. And and I've been trying to definitely could try a lot harder, but I've been wanting to connect with the with the Pacific culture, with the islander cultures in the Pacific, and to find those commonalities between the Caribbean and the islands of the Pacific. I think that we could probably find a lot of commonality. I had in this space fellow friend Michael from Guam, and and we exchange about the dynamics, of course, the dynamics of colonialism, of course, because we're both colonies of the same empire. And I guess you also have the American Samoa, so interesting dynamic. Just very that's just me very curious. What is the dynamic between American Samoa and then just I'm not going to say mainline Samoa or
Yeah. Oh gosh, I don't feel qualified to answer that question. Only because like there's not a lot of American Samoans in New Zealand, or that I grew up with anyway. There are some, like there's a famous All Black, but I think you need to speak to someone mainland stateside. In terms of that, my understanding is that probably little when you find yourselves in a different country, just trying to do life together and have those shared experiences. But someone else will be better to answer that. I'm not sure.
entirely. And I guess it also speaks as to how you're so close and so far away. I mean, the idiosyncrasy or the experience of having to cope with what American Samoa has had to cope is a lot.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And the last question I have for you, I formulate this question based on utopias, our utopias or the utopias, as Uruguayan author Eduardo Galeano would have it in one of his texts, talk about, there is this reference in the horizon, and I am taking 5 steps towards it, and it takes 5 steps, and then I take 10 steps towards it, and it takes 10 more steps, and then you're like, and then what is this? What is this unattainable process? What is the point? And he goes on and says, well, the point is that you keep on doing that you keep on moving forward, that you don't stay still. So for you, Andre, what are those utopias that allow you to, even when we live in a world that's infested with, you gotta get the trophy, you gotta get the trophy to know what it's about, and we sabotage and we hijack and we completely disregard the processes. So what are those utopias, as a final question for you, that allow you to keep on pressing on even when it doesn't feel like that we should sometimes?
Yeah, I think just in the practical sense, surviving, have to go to work. No, just kidding. I've got no choice anyway. So, but I think it's funny. I was meeting with my church pastor last week, and I was just thinking in terms of ministry next year. And certainly, like since I stopped being a pastor, I've never stopped going to my church. Unless I'm traveling. So I'm always there supporting where I can and where I don't get the church into trouble, like in terms of, in a low key way. But I think, but one of the things that I talked to her about is actually, I think if I'm going to invest any time in ministry, it's probably going to be with a rainbow inclusive ministry next year. That's where I put my energy and my time into. So no disrespect to the straights, but I just kind of feel like there's so many environments by which heterosexual people can find acceptance, in the church, and there's less of those spaces for rainbow people, and even less within faith communities. So for me, the utopia is that I do believe God has given me gifts and talents to minister, and also forget the gifts and talents. I just enjoy doing it, and hopefully my story can help other people. So I think the new utopia for me is actually don't let, I suppose, the mainstream society or their acceptance of you or not affect like the God-given gifts that God has given you, and also the call that he has on your life. So the utopia for me is actually, how can I now invest my energy in the next part of my life to actually really focusing on supporting rainbow, sort of communities to accept and love themselves within the Christian cohort or religious cohorts. So I think that's one sort of utopia for me. The other is my family. I've got 2 nephews and a niece who I just love dearly, and I want to be a cool uncle to them. And I say cool, not the cool uncle. Family or whatever, but I would hope that they would have values of altruism and benevolence and want to give their lives in service to something, whether it's through their profession or volunteering. I hope that's the sort of stuff that I would hope to inspire them to do, but not with the pressure that I had, that we had growing up, where you had to do these things as because it would look good. I hope that would come naturally and organically to them, and when it does, that I would hope that that they might be able to look at me and say, oh yeah, similar to what Uncle has done in this sort of space and that. Yeah.
And that's what would make you cool.
Yeah, totally. Hopefully. Maybe not. Just kidding.
Andre, gracias. I really appreciate this wonderful space and ability to be able to converse with you and hear a bit of your story and feel a little tad bit closer to you through this tertulia, through this interaction and conversation. I have been truly privileged to have been part of this exchange.
Yeah. And Angel, likewise, thank you, Naomi, for being so gracious in terms of extending the invitation for me to interview me, but also the way in which you conducted the interview. More importantly, thanks for the amazing stories that you're putting out there. It's just amazing. And thank you for, I've watched your interviews that you've done with other people like my friend Anthony Van Brown, and you're just beautiful. You just provide an environment of safety, and you're so onto it, and you're so smart, and yet you don't impose yourself into the conversation. So I just want to thank you for allowing a platform for people and many other people like me to share our experiences. Yeah, you're awesome.
It's a mutual treat. Thank you so much, and everyone also who's been watching either now or in recorded mode. That's I really value the fact that you lend your ears or your eyes, and I hope this can move you, can educate you, can stir something in you, and inspire you to also converse. And I like to close off with this. I don't know if you know of, there was this very famous Puerto Rican astrologer who actually has a documentary on Netflix called Mucho Mucho Amor, a documentary about Walter Mercado, who was a very interesting persona to study. And there's a great documentary, as I said, called Mucho Mucho Amor, definitely worth watching on Netflix. And he would close off every one of his sessions when he was alive. Les deseo, like I wish, que tengan mucha paz. You have a lot of peace, much peace. But everything else, que tengan mucho, mucho amor. Lots of love. And we definitely need it. So, mucho amor, people. We'll see each other next time. Don't disconnect just now, Andre. Until tomorrow, my friends. See you around. Ciao.
Ciao.